13th tribe, the Khazar Empire and its heritage.
The Polish kingdom adopted from its very beginning under the Piast dynasty a resultantly Western orientation, together with Roman Catholicism. But compared with its Western neighbors, it was culturally and economically an underdeveloped country. Hence, the policy of attracting immigrants, Germans from the West, Armenians and Khazar Jews from the East, and giving them every possible encouragement for their enterprise, including royal charters detailing their duties and special privileges. In the charter issued by Boleslav the Pious in 1264 and confirmed by Casimir the Great in 1334, Jews were granted the right to maintain their own synagogues, schools, and courts, to hold landed property, and engage in any trade or occupation they chose. Under the rule King Stephen Bathory, 1575-86, Jews were granted a parliament of their own, which met twice a year and had the power to levy taxes on their co-religionists. After the destruction of their country, Khazar Jewry had entered on a new chapter in its history. A striking illustration for their privileged condition is given in a papal brevet, issued in the second half of the 13th century, probably by Pope Clement IV, and addressed to an unnamed Polish prince. In this document, the Pope lets it be known that the Roman authorities are well aware of their existence of a considerable number of synagogues in several Polish cities. Indeed, no less than 5 synagogues in one city alone. He deplores the fact that these synagogues are reported to be taller than the churches, more stately and ornamental, and roofed with colorful painted laden plates, making the adjacent Catholic churches look poor in comparison. One is reminded of Musadi's gleeful remark that the minaret of the main mosque was the tallest building in Atil. The complaints in the brevet are further authenticated by a decision of the papal legate, Cardinal Guido, dated 1267, stipulating that Jews should not be allowed more than one synagogue to a town. We gather from these documents, which are roughly contemporaneous with the Mongol conquest of Khazaria, that already at that time there must have been considerable members of Khazars present in Poland, if they had in several towns more than one synagogue, and that they must have been fairly prosperous to build them so stately and ornamental. This leads us to the question of the approximate size and composition of the Khazar immigration into Poland. Regarding the numbers involved, we have no reliable information to guide us. We remember that the Arab sources speak of Khazar armies numbering 300,000 men involved in the Muslim-Khazar wars. And even if allowance is made for quite wild exaggerations, this would indicate a total Khazar population of at least 500,000 souls. Ibn Fadlan gave the number of tenths of the Volga Bulgars as 50,000, which would mean a population of 300 to 400,000, roughly the same order of magnitude as the Khazars. On the other hand, the number of Jews in the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom in the 17th century is also estimated by modern historians as 500,000, 5% of the total population. These figures do not fit in too badly with the known facts about a protracted Khazar migration via the Ukraine to Poland, Lithuania, starting with the destruction of Sarkel and the rise of the Piast dynasty towards the end of the first millennium, accelerating during the Mongol conquest and being more or less completed in the 15th through 16th centuries, by which time the steppe had been emptied and the Khazars had apparently been wiped off the face of the earth. Altogether, this population transfer was spread out over 5 or 6 centuries of trickle and flow. If we take into account the considerable influx of Jewish refugees from Byzantium and the Muslim world into Khazaria, and a small population increase among the Khazars themselves, it appears plausible that the tentative figures for the Khazar population at its peak in the 8th century should be comparable to that of the Jews in Poland in the 17th century, at least by order of magnitude, give or take a few 100,000 as a token of our ignorance. There is irony hidden in these numbers. According to the article, Statistics in the Jewish Encyclopedia, in the 17th century, the total Jewish population of the world amounted to about 1 million. This seems to indicate, as Polyak, Kutschera, and others had pointed out, that during the Middle Ages, the majority of those who professed the Judaic faith were Khazars. The substantial part of this majority went to Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and the Balkans, where they founded that Eastern Jewish community, which in its turn became the dominant majority of world Jewry. Even if the original core of that community was diluted and augmented by immigrants from other regions, its predominantly Khazar Turkish derivation appears to be supported by strong evidence and should at least be regarded as a theory worth serious discussion. Additional reasons for attributing the leading role in the growth and development of the Jewish community in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, mainly to the Khazar element and not to immigrants from the West, will be discussed in the chapters that follow. But it may be appropriate at this point to quote the Polish historian Adam Vetulani. Polish scholars agree that these older settlements were founded by Jewish immigrants from the Khazar state and Russia, while the Jews from southern and western Europe began to arrive and settle only later, and that a certain proportion at least of the Jewish population, in earlier times the main bulk, originated from the east, from the Khazar country, and later from Kievan, Russia. So much for size. But what do we know of the social structure and composition of the Khazar immigrant community? The first impression one gains is a striking similarity between certain privileged positions held by Khazar Jews in Hungary and in Poland in those early days. Both the Hungarian and Polish sources refer to Jews employed as mint masters, administrators of the royal revenue, controllers of the salt monopoly, tax collectors, and money lenders. Example, bankers. This parallel suggests a common origin of those two immigrant communities. And as we can trace the origins of the bulk of Hungarian Jewry to the Magyar-Khazar nexus, the conclusion seems self-evident. The early records reflect the part played by immigrant Jews in the two countries' budding economic life. That it was an important part is not surprising, since foreign trade and the levying of customs duties had been the Khazars' principal source of income in the past. They had the experience which their new hosts were lacking, and it was only logical that they were called in to advise and participate in the management of the finances of court and nobility. The coins minted in the 12th and 13th centuries with Polish inscriptions in Hebrew lettering are somewhat bizarre relics of these activities. The exact purpose they served is still somewhat of a mystery. Some bear the name of a king, Lisek, Maizko. Others are inscribed from the house of Abraham ben Joseph the Prince, possibly the minter-banker himself, or shows just a word of benediction, luck, or blessing. Significantly, contemporary Hungarian sources also speak of the practices of minting coins from silver provided by Jewish owners. However, in contrast to Western Europe, finance and commerce were far from being the only fields of Jewish activity. Some rich immigrants became landowners in Poland as Count Teka was in Hungary. Jewish landholdings comprising a whole village of Jewish farmers are recorded. For instance, in the vicinity of Breslau before 1203, and in the early days there must have been Khazar peasants in considerable numbers, as the ancient Khazar place names seem to indicate. A tantalizing glimpse of how some of these villages may have come into being is provided by the Karaite records mentioned before. They relate how Prince Witold settled a group of Karaite prisoners of war in Krasna, providing them with houses, orchards, and land to a distance of 1.5 miles. Krasna has been tentatively identified with the Jewish small town Krasnoia in Podolia. But farming did not hold out a fortune for the Jewish community. There were several reasons for this. The rise of feudalism in the 14th century gradually transformed the peasant of Poland into serfs, forbidden to leave their villages, deprived of freedom of movement. At the same time, under the joint pressure of the ecclesiastic hierarchy and the feudal landlords, the Polish Parliament in 1496 forbade the acquisition of agricultural land by Jews. But the process of alienation from the soil must have started long before that. Apart from the specific causes just mentioned, religious discrimination, combined with the degradation of the free peasants into serfs, the transformation of the predominantly agricultural nation of Khazars into a predominantly urban community reflected a common phenomenon in the history of migrations. Faced with different climatic conditions and farming methods on the one hand, and on the other with the unexpected opportunities for an easier living offered by urban civilization, immigrant populations are apt to change their occupational structure within a few generations. The offspring of Abruzzi peasants in the New World became waiters and restaurateurs. The grandsons of Polish farmers may become engineers or psychoanalysts. However, the transformation of Khazar Jewry into Polish Jewry did not entail any brutal break with the past or loss of identity. It was a gradual, organic process of change, which, as Polyak has convincingly shown, preserved some vital traditions of Khazar communal life in their new country. This was mainly achieved through the emergence of a social structure or way of life found nowhere else in the world: diaspora, the Jewish small town. In Hebrew, Arak; in Yiddish, Shizel; in Polish, Miastiko. All three designations are diminutives, which, however, do not necessarily refer to smallness in size. Some were quite big small towns, but to the limited rights of municipal self-government they enjoyed. The shtetl should not be confused with the ghetto. The latter consisted of a street or quarter in which Jews were compelled to live within the confines of a Gentile town. It was from the second half of the 16th century onward the universal habitat of Jews everywhere in the Christian and most of the Muslim world. The ghetto was surrounded by walls, with gates that were locked at night. It gave rise to claustrophobia and mental inbreeding, but also to a sense of relative security in times of trouble. As it could not expand in size, the houses were tall and narrow-chested, and permanent overcrowding created deplorable sanitary conditions. It took great spiritual strength for people living in such circumstances to keep their self-respect. Not all of them did. The shtetl, on the other hand, was quite different proposition, a type of settlement which, as already said, existed only in Poland, Lithuania, and nowhere else in the world. It was a self-contained country town with an exclusively or predominantly Jewish population. The shtetl's origins probably date back to the 13th century and may represent the missing link, as it were, between the market towns of Khazar and the Jewish settlements in Poland. The economic and social functions of the semi-rural, semi-urban agglomerations seem to have been similar in both countries. In Khazaria, as later in Poland, they provided a network of trading posts or market towns which mediated between the needs of the big towns and the countryside. They had regular fairs at which sheep and cattle, alongside the goods manufactured in the towns and the products of the rural cottage industries, were sold or bartered. At the same time, they were the centers where artisans plied their crafts, from wheelwrights to blacksmiths, silversmiths, tailors, kosher butchers, millers, bakers, and candlestick makers. There were also letter writers for the illiterate, synagogues for the faithful, inns for travelers, and a heder, Hebrew for room, which served as a school. There were itinerant storytellers and folk bards. Some of their names, such as Velvel, Zibarzer, have been preserved. Traveling from shtetl to shtetl in Poland, and no doubt earlier on in Khazaria, if one is to judge by the survival of storytellers among Oriental people to our day. Some particular trades became virtually a Jewish monopoly in Poland. One was dealing in timber, which reminds one that timber was the chief building material and an important export in Khazaria. Another was transport, the dense net of chattels. Writes Polyak, made it possible to distribute manufactured goods over the whole country by means of the superbly built Jewish type of horse cart. The preponderance of this kind of transport, especially in the east of the country, was so marked, amounting to a virtual monopoly, that the Hebrew word for carter, Baal Agala, was incorporated into the Russian language as Balagula. Only the development of the railway in the second half of the 19th century led to a decline in this trade. Now, this specialization in coach building and cartering could certainly not have developed in the closed ghettos of Western Jewry. It unmistakably points to a Khazar origin. The people of the ghettos were sedentary, while the Khazars, like other semi-nomadic people, used horse or ox-drawn carts to transport their tents, goods, and chattel, including royal tents the size of a circus, fit to accommodate several hundred people. They certainly had the know-how to negotiate the roughest tracks in their new country. Other specifically Jewish occupations were innkeeping, the running of flour mills, and trading in furs, none of them found in the ghettos of Western Europe. Such, in broad outlines, was the structure of the Jewish chattel in Poland. Some of its features could be found in old market towns in any country. Others show a more specific affinity with what we know, little though it is, about the township of Khazaria, which were probably the prototypes of the Polish chattel. To these specific features should be added the pagoda style of the oldest surviving wooden chattel synagogues dating from the 15th and 16th centuries, which is totally different from both the native style of architecture and from the building style adopted by Western Jews and replicated later on in the ghettos of Poland. The interior decoration of the oldest chattel synagogues is also quite different from the style of the Western ghetto. The walls of the chattel synagogue were covered with Moorish Arab scales and with animal figures characteristic of the Persian influence found in Magyar Khazar artifacts and in the decorative style brought to Poland by Armenian immigrants. The traditional garb of Polish Jewry is also of unmistakable Eastern origin. The typical long silk kaftan may have been an imitation of the coat worn by the Polish nobility, which itself was copied from the outfit of the Mongols in the Golden Horde. Fashions travel across political divisions, but we know that kaftans were worn long before that by the nomads of the steppes. The skull cap, yarmulke, is worn to this day by Orthodox Jews and by the Uzbeks and other Turkish people in the Soviet Union. On top of the skull cap, men wore the stremel, an elaborate round hat rimmed with fox fur, which the Khazars copied from the Kazakhs, or vice versa. As already mentioned, the trade in fox and sable furs, which had been flourishing in Khazaria, became another virtual Jewish monopoly in Poland. As for the women, they wore, until the middle of the 19th century, a tall white turban, which was an exact copy of the jayuluk worn by Kazakh and Turkmen women. Now, Orthodox Jewesses have to wear, instead of a turban, a wig made of their own hair, which is shaved off when they get married. One might also mention in this context, though somewhat dubiously, the Polish Jewish odd passion for gefilte, stuffed fish, a national dish which the Polish Gentiles adopted. Without fish, the saying went, there is no Sabbath. Was it derived from distant memories of life on the Caspian, where fish was the staple diet? Life in the shtetl is celebrated with much romantic nostalgia in Jewish literature and folklore. Thus, we read in a modern survey of its customs about the joyous way its inhabitants celebrated the Sabbath. Wherever one is, he will try to reach home in time to greet the Sabbath with his own family. The peddler traveling from village to village, the itinerant tailor, shoemaker, cobbler, the merchant off on a trip, all will plan, push, hurry, try to reach home before sunset on Friday evening. As they press homeward, the shamis calls through the streets of the shtetl, Jews to the bathhouse. A functionary of the synagogue. The shamis is a combination of sexton and beadle. He speaks with an authority more than his own, for when he calls Jews to the bathhouse, he is summoning them to a commandment. The most vivid evocation of life in the Shatif is the surrealistic amalgam of fact and fantasy in the paintings and lithographs of Mark Chagall, where biblical symbols appear side by side with the bearded carter wielding his whip and wistful rabbis in kaftan and yarmulke. In this weird community, reflecting its weird origins, some of the earliest small towns were probably founded by prisoners of war, such as the Karaites of Troki, whom Polish and Lithuanian nobles were anxious to settle on their empty lands. But the majority of these settlements were products of the general migration away from the wild fields, which were turning into deserts. After the Mongol conquest, wrote Polyak, when the Slav villages wandered westward, the Khazar shtetls went with them. The pioneers of the new settlements were probably rich Khazar traders who constantly traveled across Poland on the much frequented trade routes into Hungary. The Magyar and Kabar migration into Hungary blazed the trail for the growing Khazar settlements in Poland. It turned Poland into a transit area between the two countries with Jewish communities. Thus, the traveling merchants were familiar with conditions in the prospective areas of resettlement and had occasion to make contact with the landowners in search of tenants. The landlord would enter into an agreement with such rich and respected Jews. We are reminded of Abraham Prokownik, as would settle on his estate and bring in other settlers. They would, as a rule, choose people from the place where they had lived. These colonists would be an assorted lot of farmers, artisans, and craftsmen, forming a more or less self-supporting community. Thus, the Khazar chattel would be transplanted and become a Polish chattel. Farming would gradually drop out, but by that time the adaptation to changed conditions would have been completed. The nucleus of modern Jewry thus followed the old recipe. Strike out for new horizons, but stick together. Stay tuned for the next exciting chapter. Where from?